Time.
I am recording and I'm gonna put me on mute. Crazy. Go crazy.
Perfect. So I'm sure most of you already at least know me a little bit, but I'm Tyler Tress. I'm a second year PhD student in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts over on Court Street. And I am really right now, my research is focusing on, as those of you who were at my ACDA talk last week, focusing on the so-called holy minimalists. But I've also spent a fair time looking at medieval chant, from which those composers typically draw some sort of inspiration or material. And so today I'm going to present on sort of my understanding of Gregorian chant as learned through a few years of study and spending a bit of time with a bunch of monks who just sing it and talk about it and make it happen literally every day of the year. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. There you all are, and I'm going to make you go away so you can see my screen better. Okay, there we go. So, everyone with a degree in music has encountered Gregorian chant. Music history textbooks always have an obligatory section on chant, if only to declare it the foundation of Western music, and then move on to the good stuff, polyphony. This creates a problem for singers if they ever come across it after graduation. They've heard of Gregorian chant, but they don't have a clue how to sing it. Maybe they've been fortunate enough to have a conductor who programs chant repertoire, but there's something to be said for serious exploration and study. In this talk, I will address 3 points. I will give an all too brief historical account of the Gregorian chant tradition, beginning with its origins and ending in the mid-20th century, with commentary on the current state of the repertoire and the preservation of the tradition. Then I will make a few remarks on the notation itself and highlight what a singer needs to know to interpret it. Finally, I will share some of my thoughts on the singing of chant from a more technical perspective, addressing the vocal mechanism and how a singer ought to prepare. I would like to start, in fact, with an image, a rather famous one. As the story goes, the origin of Gregorian chant. Seated behind a curtain, Pope Gregory the Great receives the chant from the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove and dictates it to a scribe. The scribe simply can't help himself and peeks through the curtain. While Gregory the Great was indeed a proponent of liturgical reform, the extent of his involvement in the development of the Gregorian chant remains unknown. In fact, the first attribution of the chant to Gregory was made centuries after his death. More instrumental was Charlemagne, who standardized liturgical music as part of his attempt to unify his empire in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. This established Gregorian chant as the music of the church. There were other chant traditions, Beneventan, Ambrosian, and Old Roman, for example, but they survive only in manuscripts and were in practice displaced. This period also saw the development of musical notation, though an early manuscript would be unintelligible to the modern singer. More on that in the second section. The notation most associated with chant was developed sometime in the early 11th century, attributed to Guido of Arezzo. He developed a 4-line staff and the system of solmization, now known as solfeggio. He did this using the pictured hymn. Each half stanza begins one note higher than the last and took its name, if you will, from the syllable of text underneath it, hence ut, re, mi, fa, sol, and la. Chant eventually became the foundations of polyphony, and the practice of using chant melodies as a cantus firmus, the base of a polyphonic composition, endured well into the Renaissance. Over the course of the following centuries, polyphony became more complex, and secular tunes were being used instead of chant melodies. This tension came to a head in 1545 at the Council of Trent. In the wake of Luther's Reformation, the Catholic Church saw the need to reassert its authority, including a push from the more conservative bishops to forbid polyphony and return to the exclusive use of chant. These bishops were assuaged by Palestrina, with the Missa Papae Marcelli, a setting dedicated to Pope Marcellus II. Here we see Palestrina presenting a work to Pope Julius III, who initially brought him into Rome. Gregorian chant was also championed by the Cecilian movement in Germany, which was specifically concerned with the quality of church music. A reaction against the Enlightenment, they can be seen as a sort of continuation of the conservative impulses of the Council of Trent. This draws a parallel to the Austrian composer Anton Bruckner, who, at least in his choral music, was emulating Palestrina. Bruckner himself was a devout Catholic and received his musical education at the monastery of St. Florian. Oh, forgive me, this is, I think, the wrong version of this PowerPoint. We will attempt to fix. Oh well, does not matter. We will forge on. This was not, however, a purely German phenomenon, as I believe I've already said. In France, at the Abbey of St. Peter of Salem, Dom Prosper Guéranger, 1805 to 1875, began the work of restoring the chant from surviving manuscripts at the direction of Pope Leo XIII. Composer Maurice Duruflé was steeped in this tradition, and his Requiem, Opus 9, is built almost entirely on chant melodies borrowed from the Mass for the Dead. The 20th century also had its own share of liturgical reforms, first under Pius X, and then, perhaps infamously, under John the 23rd's Second Vatican Council, often called Vatican II. While Vatican II is often understood as a move away from Latin toward the vernacular, the documents themselves assert a need to prioritize the use of chant in the Mass. The only problem was that a good deal of the chant was only in Latin. Enter Father Columba Kelly, a monk of St. Meinrad Archabbey in St. Meinrad, Indiana, who spent over half a century adapting, composing, and teaching English language plainsong. At St. Meinrad, monks, community members, and visitors celebrate the Mass and pray the Liturgy of the Hours in English using the chant that Father Columba created. Though he passed away in 2018, Father Columba's colleagues and students continue his annual Gregorian Chant Institute, where visitors of all kinds live, pray, and study at the monastery for a week at a time. My own understanding of Gregorian chant and plainsong was formed during 3 of these week-long workshops in the summers of 2018 and 2019. Now, we should address the issue of notation. What we're seeing here is the same chant, Qui manducat carnem meam, on pages taken from two manuscripts, Laon 139 on the left and Einsiedeln 121 on the right. This is that unintelligible pre-Guidonian notation that I mentioned earlier. At first glance, it appears to be dots and lines and assorted squiggles over the text. This paleography is more of a mnemonic device than notation as we understand it. It doesn't tell you what to sing, rather it reminds you of something you've learned by ear. This, scholars argue, is an indication of the origins of chant as an oral tradition. Regardless, we should investigate this notion a little further. Here we see the same chant from each manuscript, isolated and magnified. If we look closely, we can see that while they're not exactly the same, they are quite similar. We can also see that this is not a particularly precise form of notation. This raises an important question. How do we know which pitches to sing? Luckily, Guido devised his 4-line staff notation to answer that exact question. The image on the left is the same chant in square notation. However, you might be asking how exactly we got from squiggles to squares. The image on the right is the same chant yet again, shown as it appears in the Graduale triplex, which shows the chant in, as the name would suggest, 3 lines. In the middle is the familiar square notation. The black paleography above it is taken from the Laon manuscript, and the red underneath from the Einsiedeln manuscript. Taken together, we can see that each shows a similar overall shape for the melody. This is all well and good, but there are a few things on the page to address before we can sing it. To do that, we'll isolate the page from the triplex. We'll go left to right, top to bottom, as if we were reading it to sing it. First, notice the Roman numeral 6 and the C clef on the top line. This tells us that we're in mode 6, the Hypolydian mode. At the end of the first phrase, we see a dot next to the square note and a short vertical line. This line is called an epizema. They can be either vertical, functioning like something between a breath mark and a bar line, or horizontal, marking emphasis, as we see over the second syllable of bibit. Next, at the end of the first staff, we see a small half square. This is not a pitch or neume, but a kustos, which shows the first pitch on the next staff. Why we got rid of those, I'll never know. On the next staff, we see a similar square with a dot, vertical epizema combination. Then over in, we have a regular-sized square and a smaller one attached to it. The small square is a liquescent and is used primarily for voiced consonants like N, M, and L. Over the next syllable, you'll see we have a square note that looks a little, we'll call it fuzzy. This is a qualisma and is somewhere between a slur and a glissando. After monet, we have another vertical epizema, this one longer than the previous two. Now, we look at the word in as it appears here. This may look like something very complicated, but it's just a parectus, a group of 3 in which the middle pitch is lower than the 2 surrounding it. Finally, after both Dominus and the Eastertide Alleluia, we see a vertical epizema kind of structure that we can recognize as a double bar line. Now that I've explained some of the features of this notation, I should demonstrate. And then I'll share a few thoughts on how to sing this repertoire effectively. Qui manducat carnem meam, et bibit sanguinem meum, in me manet, et ego in eo dicit Dominus. Even though it is technically incorrect because we are not in Eastertide, I'll sing the Alleluia just because there's another liquescent in there. Alleluia. That's just to give you a sense. Now, some thoughts. This will be a rather short section by design. To sing Gregorian chant, you ought to prepare as you would for any other sort of repertoire. If it's in Latin, find a translation. Then speak the text before you even look at the pitches. Remember, you're after rhythm and inflection of the language. The epizemas can help you with this. Then tackle the pitches. If you've ever wondered when learning to read C clefs would come in handy, this is one of those moments. I haven't said anything about the timbre you should aim for, but that's very much by design. I would suggest merely relaxing into the sound. Don't stray into sing straight tone, but remember this isn't an opera house. Sing with enough support to maintain an easy, free, and in tune sound, and that will be well received. I should let Father Columba have the last word. As he always said, if you speak a language, you have everything you need to sing chant. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I would love to open the floor for any questions and some discussion. Thank you, Nick.
I have a question.
Yes.
So you used a bit of vibrato when you sang. I wanted to know if it's similar to timbre in that there probably was no standard back then. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how.
Oh, that's a fantastic question, because I have a very wonderful story from a conductor I was fortunate enough to work with in Chicago. He's this delightfully British little man, and part of his dissertation, his main research was in Anglican music and sort of the music of Byrd and Tallis. And he said, you know, people always ask me about vibrato, and I show them the pictures I've got of when I looked at the payroll of the Royal Chapel when Byrd and Tallis were choir masters there. And you see singers who were well into their 60s and 70s. I dare you to tell me they didn't sing with vibrato. And, you know, I think it's such an interesting question, and I'm so glad you asked it, because while I agree with your initial point that, you know, there was likely no standard, and, you know, realistically, I think it's a very different thing to hear sort of a professionally trained classical singer do this, or even a perfectly rehearsed chant schola sing it for a recording. It's another thing to hear, you know, the abbey choir are all the monks in the abbey, even the ones who are not particularly involved with the music other than just singing during the liturgy. So, you know, and I think a great deal of this is personal preference. I do not think that trying extra hard to kill naturally occurring vibrato will do anything other than give you intonation problems.
I ask because I've always, you know, in church jobs when you're singing early music, there's always, I feel like people often kind of feel a pressure to sing with no vibrato whatsoever. And I've always kind of thought that, you know, you have to try to sing with no vibrato. So I feel like it doesn't make sense that everybody, you know, before the year 1800 sang with absolutely no vibrato whatsoever. So that's
right. So, and, you know, this is kind of just me speculating here, but I'm very, very intrigued by the sort of period from like 1970 to the early mid 1990s, that sort of early music revival. Because, you know, I think up until and even through that point, you get people, and I think the best example of this for you choral people out there is Robert Shaw. It's almost like you can pinpoint the exact moment when he switched from just doing whatever the heck he wanted to with this music into doing, you know, something very performance practice-y. And I think the performance practice is well and good as long as you remember that at the end of the day, this is music. It's a very specific kind of music with a very particular purpose. But, you know, and I'll be real with you here. In my experience at St. Meinrad, I often found myself being the sort of the advocate for the singers with classical training, because there is, unfortunately, a sort of instant connection. It's like, oh, vibrato, boom, this person thinks they're hot shit and it's all about them. And, you know, ultimately, I think the music directors who have been conditioned to think that way have been exposed not to, you know, classically trained singers who are doing chant for the first time, but rather have been exposed to, you know, quite talented amateurs who just happen to be Catholic. And that's where the element of really understanding that, you know, as Father Columba would say, this is I see you too, Nana, don't worry. This is the thing with chant, you know, it's sung speech. And the minute you lose sight of the fact that, you know, he always said any good whiskey drinker would tell you, chant is drinking the word of God straight. I'm very, very disappointed that he passed literally like a month before I got to the Archabbey. But I'm very fortunate to be acquainted with his wonderful colleagues and students. Nana, go ahead.
Okie doke. Let me lower my hand. I'll do it after I talk. Anyways, so I have a question in regards to, two questions. One is when it comes to Gregorian chant, is it more so like during that era? Because I know there are European and then there's like Russian, like they're different, but I also know that the church split up into kind of
yes,
like, you know, more Russian and, you know, European, but like, is there like, you know?
So that's, that's a wonderful question. And it's a very, I think, astute question, because we say the word chant, and chant encompasses so many things. It is a word so associated with so many things that are not at all related that at a certain point, the word chant by itself becomes unhelpful. And so keeping the distinction within Christian chant, you're absolutely right that the earliest form of plainsong, we don't know 100% where it came from. Some of the scholarship really suggests that the first, because singing in worship, singing the praises of God, that is scriptural. That is something that was happening in the early church. The Bible says to sing to the Lord, God knows how many times. And so the best we can tell is that it originated in the early Syrian Christian tradition.
Okay.
And then this is sort of a loose genealogy, and it's very loose by nature of both what I know and by nature of the primary sources that have survived. But the Syriac tradition kind of birthed what we now call Byzantine chant. And Byzantine and Gregorian chant are interesting in that they I use kind of very loosely, use a similar division of the octave when you're talking about modes. They just number the modes quite differently. And then it gets really tricky because in the Byzantine tradition, the idea of a mode is quite different in that you have sort of the liturgical year, and you have different modes that are associated with certain sort of liturgical seasons.
The calendar or the holiday?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
So
okay,
it's like,
okay, cool.
So it's like, I'm probably going to get this wrong, so good thing we're recording off the top of my head. But it's like, it's like, oh, we're in Lent, so a lot of the music is going to be in mode 2.
Right.
And
symbolically, there's some symbolism based upon
right.
the liturgical calendar. Okay.
Right.
Cool.
But in the same way, to an extent, Byzantine chant is also very attached to the text. And, there have been really 3 periods in the notation of Byzantine chant, and they all look more similar to the pre-Guidonian paleography, just the sort of dots and squiggles over the Latin, than they do to the square notation. They never, for whatever reason, they never saw the point to develop the notation beyond that, which actually led to a very big problem for a while, because they could read the Crescentian notation that they read now, that was developed sort of around the turn of the 20th century, and they could read the Middle Byzantine notation, but they didn't know how to read the earliest until they reverse engineered it from some of the Middle Byzantine manuscripts. So, and in that tradition, that's a whole 3 other talks on its own.
Right.
With someone way more qualified than me. Go ahead.
I do have.
Please.
Okay, just one more question.
Please.
Okay, so when it comes to singing Gregorian chant, is there particular types of songs that if there's a hierarchy, certain people can sing it? Because I know for being a monk or say
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking more so of as a nun, there's certain steps before you're accepted as a nun, knocking on the doors for a certain amount of days,
right.
or is there a ranking where you cannot join us for these types of works, to sing with this type of works, because you haven't gone through a certain process, and then comparing that.
Yeah.
Comparing that to like Jewish, because I know like with like people who are chanting like Jewish, I don't know, maybe not even connecting with Gregorian chant, but the point of like there's certain people that are designated to sing those kind of things or allowed to, respectively.
That's a very good question. I'm going to kind of skirt around the Jewish cantillation part of your question because
That's only like the hierarchy. Basically, that was like an example of like allowed
I'm
to.
completely unfamiliar with that tradition, but it's a very good question, and it's a very interesting question, and it's frankly something I should have included because it's good information for singers to know. I had a friend who is not, kind of uninitiated, not a practicing Christian, never really has been, and she was hired to sing a friend's wedding at a Catholic church, and she just started singing everything on the page, and the organist just stopped her mid-rehearsal and said, "You're obviously not Catholic, are you?" And she said, "No, why do you, what gave me away?" And she's like, "Oh, you're singing the part that's for the priest." And so, there are parts in the Mass. Really, the distinction is not made in sort of strict religious hierarchy, but there are things for the priest, things for the cantor or the choir, and things for the people. And so and it kind of varies from place to place. Something that they do at St. Meinrad a lot is they'll have the cantor or the group of cantors sing a verse of the psalm, and then everybody else will sing the next verse with the same music, and then you'll just alternate cantor and people.
Yeah, that's how I had a gig like that.
Yeah. And so it's ultimately you just kind of have to know who's supposed to do what, and ultimately what you'll end up singing in a Catholic service, at least the ones that use chant repertoire frequently, you'll have things like entrance antiphons. There will be communion antiphons, which is what the chant I sang for you tonight is. I forget the translation of that one. No, it's "He who eats my body and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him, saith the Lord." And then something that will happen a lot with this is the singing of the Psalms. And it'll be, as I described, typically an alteration between cantor and congregation or the people.
Cool. Thank you.
Very good question. Thank you. Anything else?
I'm a person of many questions, so it pops up.
I have a question, Tyler.
Yeah.
Bet you didn't expect that one, did you? So, thinking about how, I want to talk about the church modes, if that's okay. I kind of am really interested in how the church modes kind of came about from the idea of the octave species back in the ancient Greek music tradition. And a lot of the philosophers had, ideas about which octave species are good and which ones we're going to avoid, and the ones that, inspire you to be great and such. And I wondered if there were any similar connotations that we could apply to chant.
Very good question. And the answer is yes, in a word, but don't worry, I'll expand on that. So there have been a number of people who have, in a manner very similar to the doctrine of affections that popped up in the Enlightenment, they've assigned certain affects, or they call them moods. At St. Meinrad, they call them moods to the mode. And one of those people was actually Guido of Arezzo. The other was, I believe, was he 12th or 13th century? Adam de la Halle was one of them. And then Father Columba himself, actually, in his, I don't have it on a shelf near me, but he wrote this performance manual for Gregorian chant that's like half as thick as my face. And that's actually one of the things we talk about at these workshops, the responsibility of the music minister or music director to match the psalm text to an appropriate psalm tone. Because these, especially the modes as embodied by the psalm tones, have these very, very specific characters. It's a very good question. I'm glad you brought it up, and I hope I gave you an answer.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Yeah, the modes are a very tricky thing. The modes give me such a headache. And Nana, to circle back, because I also kind of skirted the issue of Russian chant in your question, because
I love Russian chant. Oh.
Russian chant is so beautiful, and it's fascinating because, you know, really ultimately all of this comes out of the Roman Empire, and it eventually just kind of splintered. First, the western half of the empire fell. Byzantium carried on for, you know, another 1,000 years, and then the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, came in and took Constantinople, now Istanbul, and, you know, it's that song, Istanbul, not Constantinople. The operative question being, why did Constantinople get the works? And the answer being, that's nobody's business but the Turks, which is a very clever rhyme I have to give them. But what I'm working my way towards here in terms of a point is this idea that, you know, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, it didn't go away when Byzantium fell.
Right.
It sort of moved up into Russia. And so you get, you know, Russian music that is very, very beautiful, but quite distinct from Gregorian chant. And of course, chant in the modern Orthodox Church is another like 3 talks, because much like the Western Church, the Latin Church, before the standardization of the chant by Charlemagne, the chant in the Orthodox Christian countries is very, very regionally specific. So you have various kinds of chant in Russia. You've got the Znameny chant, which, if you're familiar with the Rachmaninoff Vespers, I used this example last week, the Bogorodice Dievo raduj. That's
Blagodat Maria, hotspots to boyu.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
The Vespers, the all-night vigil, more properly called, is all based on Znameny chant. There's also, you know, Kievan chant. There's the Obichod, which is a little simpler, a little more widespread. There's also, you know, like Serbian chant. I've been working with a conductor on and off for the past couple of years now at various things, who's a very big figure in like the Serbian chant revival after the collapse of the Soviet satellite state system. There's Georgian chant, the country, not the deep south.
I wonder how that would sound if it was.
I couldn't help myself. It's right up there. It's right up there with my Appalachian Latin joke. I can't help myself. But yeah, it's just, you bring up a very good issue, and that's one of the things that I think makes chant so daunting, because there's a very big gap, you know, they're sort of the people that are like, okay, I have a basic idea of what a mode is, which is probably like the average person with a voice degree, because let's face it, we teach you what we think you need. And then you've got sort of people like Miss Katie Lessick and me and like the far end, way off screen, Dr. Wetzel. They're like, oh yeah, what do you feel about this particular octave species? And it doesn't feel like there's a lot in between, because there is so much material and it's all very, very thorny to sift through. I know, I just went off on a bit of a tangent. Any other questions? This is very, very good discussion. I'm very, very excited. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yes, I might have an answer.
What's your favorite chant you've ever come across?
I thought you said come up with. What's the favorite thing you've ever composed?
I'm not.
Well, fun fact, I did actually back in December perform, program, and compose a couple of Gregorian chant compositions based on text from Carl Sagan's Cosmos. Didn't expect that. But, you know, my favorite chant, that's a very hard question. I do have to say that there's a very special place in my heart for the English chant that they do at St. Meinrad, because you can definitely tell it was written when it was written. You know, some of them, it's got a very, very kind of late 20th century, almost power ballad kind of feel sometimes. I'm thinking, where's one of the refrains they do a lot? It's, into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. There's something very, very weird to me. There's this seeming overlap. And, you know, I think that speaks to the fact that, you know, what these monks are really attempting to do is to create music that reflects the text. Because what they're coming up with melodically is something that trends not insignificantly towards, you know, a popular idiom of sorts. I want to say Father Columba was active from the mid-1960s up until 2018. So he covered a lot of ground. Yeah, there are, I think it's a staff of 4 or 5 organists between monks and lay people at St. Meinrad, and one of them refers to Father Columba creating all this English language chant as Father Columba's great work. And it's really interesting to see how that has evolved and now how it has turned into his legacy. There's also, for some of you more choral/teacher types, there's a guy, I think he used to teach at Westminster Choir College. I don't remember where he is now, maybe in Florida. His name is James Jordan. And
James Jordan is at Westminster Choir College.
James Jordan is the bomb.com. We love him.
I may be having him as a guest speaker for ACDA in the next semester or two. So.
Holy shit, you're kidding, really?
Nope.
I did a master class with him once. He's amazing.
Yeah, I did a master class with him in high school.
now, what Dr. Jordan does, why I bring him up, is he actually uses Gregorian chant as part of his sort of choral and vocal pedagogical approach. I'm not super familiar with his method. There's kind of a discrepancy in how chant is taught. There are sort of 2 distinct approaches. The one that I have shared with you is what we tend to call the New Salem. And it's really a return to the orality of the chant tradition. what came before the old Salem now, also called the Ward method, if you've ever just kind of clapped along and counted 2s or 3s like a creepy little Catholic robot, that is the Ward method. And it was created essentially, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to do it anyway. It was you laugh, but the Ward method was essentially created specifically so that Gregorian chant could be taught to young children. And this, I think she was a New England socialite named Justine Ward, brought one of the brothers from the Abbey of Salem over, and they devised this method of counting 2s and 3s so that in Catholic grade schools they could teach and sing and preserve Gregorian chant. But then, we started learning more and more about the orality of chant and the fact that this is something that it was learned by ear before it began to be written down. And so we've moved away from sort of a strict system of 2 and 3. I will admit that I tend to over stylize a little bit when I sing Gregorian chant. There's a subtlety. There are also, even among people who ascribe to the New Salem, there are discrepancies, like the vertical epizemas. At one point, what the monks at St. Meinrad decided to do with them changed, and half of them listened and the other half didn't. So whenever you get a vertical epizema when you're singing with the monks at St. Meinrad, half of them observe it and half of them sing through it. And the next one, the halves reverse. Or, I know one sort of musicologist who really does think that the qualisma is just a very nasty glissando, to the point where you'll be standing next to him chanting during, like, Vespers or whatever, and he'll do it and he'll like scare you a little. Because let's see if I can demonstrate. I don't think I can do it like Ray does, but in that chant, actually, in me manet, it's very, very scoopy and very aggressive, and he takes great joy in doing it that way, so more power to him. Anyway, I think we're right up at time, which is...
Yeah, I was just about to come on and tell you, thank you so much for your discussion with us. I feel like we just had like an awesome discussion.
This has been a lot of fun. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Very, very great questions.
And if you guys have any other questions for Tyler, I mean, most of you guys know him pretty well, so you can always like send him a message or chat with him later. But if you have any other questions, you're more than welcome to like message me. Yes, Eliza. Oh, that's clapping.
I think that's just clapping.
Oh, I'm just clapping.
Got it. Okay.
I'm clapping my little virtual heart out.
I'm dead.
Yes. Yeah. Please come to me with any questions or thoughts that you have. I don't know if you assume this, but it would not be like the first 3 a.m. email about Gregorian chant that I have received. And with good luck, it will not be the last. So by all means, keep in touch, and I'd love to keep this conversation going.
You're one of a kind, man. It makes me happy. I love it.
Thank God. One of everyone is too many.
Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you guys had a blast. I definitely had, and my niece is now telling my nephew to eat his broccoli. He doesn't like green things, though, so he just made a very ugly face and spit it out. Anyways, hope you enjoyed that anecdote of a child and multiple children. Tyler, you're amazing and wonderful. Thank you so much. Guys, have a wonderful rest of your week. Join us next week for Florence and Mac.
Yes, Florence Mac and Mr. Florence Mac.
Yeah, there you go. Join us next week for them when they talk about pretty much everything they do, how they've been doing it. They're probably going to talk about their technology that they're using, which is actually pretty cool. And they'll be talking about how to work with your accompanist, especially in today's day and age and all that fun stuff. I know I say today's day and age, it's weird. Anyways, have a wonderful weekend, guys. Take some time for yourself. This is the middle of the semester, so really take time to breathe. Thank you, Miss Allie. Take time to breathe. Love yourselves, love each other, and don't hesitate to talk to each other and call each other on video chat and give each other virtual hugs. So I love you guys. Be safe, be happy. I'll see you guys next week.
All right, bye.